Good evening, Renarda Joy here, and welcome to Pathway to Wealth Building. Now, before we get started, I want to know who's here. Tell me your name and where you're from. We have an exciting show tonight. We have an exciting guest, but before we get started, I want to start off with some questions. I want to know how many of you have money knowledge gaps? How many of you actually understand the inflationary spiral that we're in? And how many of you really truly understand recession, as far as like the cause and the effect? Well, I have a special guest who's going to come on and help us unpack all of these type of conversations. So make sure you grab some pen and paper because be prepared to take some good copious notes. Make sure you hang tight to the very end. I promise you, you don't want to miss any of this. And lastly, if you have any questions or if our special guest is relating to you, saying something that you can relate to, make sure you leave it in the comments. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our guest tonight. I'm going to read his bio. His name is Dr. Michael G. Thomas. He's an accredited financial counselor and a lecturer at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on financial empathy and self-compassion, data visualization's effect on financial behavior, and the connection between brain function and money. Dr. Thomas's philosophy on how to effectively interact with money can be summed up in his TED Talk, Financial Empathy, understanding the story beneath the numbers, utilizing financial empathy as a process for active listening and the creation of client-focused financial recommendations are reflected in two financial literacy and capability programs that he co-founded, Money Dogs and Discovering Money Solutions. Dr. Thomas is also the founder. You guys see, he's so amazing. I have to read it all. Dr. Thomas is also the founder of Modem Solutions, a virtual financial coaching service he has been providing since 2015. And he's also soon to be an author to add to his list of expertise as he's expecting to release this book in the fourth quarter. It's called Building Wealth from the Inside Out, the Black financial culture, building wealth the inside out. Now, let me tell you the last thing I want to say about Dr. Thomas before I bring him out. He's not caught up with the letters behind his name. Just by having offline conversation, he has a serving heart. He's similar to me. We share that idea of we're both proponents of getting education. You see, when you get educated, you are now able to mitigate risk because now you're an informed consumer, meaning you can make informed decisions. So join me in welcoming Dr. Thomas, Michael G. Thomas, to the stage. Hi, Dr. Thomas.
Good evening. Good evening. And thank you for that introduction. I appreciate it.
No worries, no
It always
worries.
makes me awkward. I don't know why.
Just to
It
hear
just
it about,
does.
like, who am I talking about, right? Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
talking
right.
about.
That's not me. I'm just a kid from Gary, Indiana. That's it.
Wow. Well, let's unpack this because I'm really excited. I know we have a limited amount of time. Now, you and I had an offline conversation, and during that conversation, you expressed some frustration about our engagement with money, being reactive versus proactive. Can you talk a little bit about that with us?
Yeah. Fortunately, a lot of financial culture in general is reactive financial culture. And because it's reactive, we lose time, we lose resources, we lose energy in navigating processes where we do the thing, and then after we do the thing, we figure out, all right, now how am I going to make it work within the context of everything else that's going on in my life? And unfortunately, in many instances, families and individuals, that's the cycle that they fall into. It's make decision, then think about how do I now retroactively go back and address something that I've done. Now, the issue there is that if you signed a 7-year or 8-year car note or a 30-year mortgage, or you've gone into business and you didn't create a business plan, you didn't thoroughly think through, because it's easy to fantasize about what something can be and could be. And I am all for that. But then also being able to see potential hurdles and barriers before they come so that then we have the time and the capacity and the mental wherewithal to be able to think about solutions before these things even arise. So I guess the best way to contextualize this is a couple, right? So let's say that somebody's in a relationship.
Okay.
Generally speaking, when there's money stress happens reactively. So what I mean by that is that if you're in a relationship, oftentimes, let's say you grew up in a household or come from a background where you never talked about money, it's very difficult for you to be vulnerable within a context of relationship. There's no financial intimacy,
Mhm.
right? As long as things are going well and
Wait,
there's
let me
no
just pause. Did you say financial intimacy? Is
yeah,
that what I
financial intimacy. Yes, that
heard?
that's that's a lot of language used in financial psychology, financial therapy, and things of that nature because there's a vulnerability that's attached to money because money actually isn't the main thing. Money is a connection to the things that we desire. So that when we fully start to understand our money connection and our desires, then we get to unpack those desires or our values or our culture or whatever it may be in a substantial way to actually say, well, is this still working for me? Is this optimal or is this suboptimal? And I know there's talks about financial literacy capability and things of that nature. My general sentiment, though, is that most people have some level of literacy, of
Mhm.
some level of financial savvy that's been taught to them, that's been passed down by aunt or uncle. This is what we needed to do to survive, and this is how we made it, right? And that
Mhm.
becomes the standard of success in some areas, and that's awesome because without them, you wouldn't have had the stepping stone to get to where you're wanting to go now. The question then becomes is does what do I know currently align with where I'm trying to go? And we have to be able to unpack that and see if we're out of alignment. So about the whole couple thing is that it's easy to navigate a relationship when everything's good and there's no financial shock and there's no frustration, there's no X, Y, and Z. We can have bad habits all day, but as long as we're earning enough money, it's a
Mhm.
non-issue, right? So ultimately what happens a lot of times is that when there is a financial shock, right? When there is a job loss, when there is an unexpected bill, that then causes and forces people to actually engage in not just money or a budget, but understanding how those line items make an individual feel. Are they financially avoidant,
Mhm.
right? And there can be a lot of different things that come about as relates to it, but learning that in the midst of stress, in the midst of financial shock and frustration, is not the time to engage in that type of level of financial intimacy, right?
And
It's I
I'm not a marriage therapist, but I can tell you these are conversations that I would imagine one should have before they actually even take that next step of getting married. Just
absolutely.
making sure, the money mindset is in place and that you're
Yeah,
both on the same page with how you actually, what are your money beliefs? How do you actually
absolutely.
deal with money?
Yeah. And even taking that a step further, when you're stressed and when you're frustrated, how do you deal with money? Right? It's really having this holistic conversation because it allows for us to understand something about a partner. And then oftentimes we can use money as a coping mechanism. We can actually self-medicate with money, which makes it difficult to actually manage money if you think about it. So if I'm working with someone and their spending plan looks like whatever it looks like, and I'm saying, hey, we're spending a good bit here. And if I don't unpack that and try to figure out why, right? Even if it is the optimal recommendation, behaviorally, psychologically, emotionally, it may not be. Financially, yes, but those other areas have to align as well. But unfortunately, what happens is that we never really not let me not say never. Um, Many households and individuals only engage in meaningful conversations about money when there's a pain point.
Mhm.
And that's the least optimal time to begin to have conversations about money because at that point, it's a nervous system response, flight or fight. And then
Right,
how can any couple, right, sit down and realistically have meaningful conversations about money when it's always under stress? And
right.
then when we're not stressed, we don't talk about it. So we don't allow ourselves to get the dopamine hit that comes from being in a great place and talking about where we're going and what we want to achieve and how we can work together to get there and actually see that happen as a couple is a beautiful thing. So we experience one side of the equation, but oftentimes we don't experience the other side of the equation, which kind of keeps us trapped in this cycle of not wanting to engage with money. And the only time we do engage with money is when there's a pain point. And then after there's a pain point and we have conversations about it, they tend to be negative, fear laden. And then that becomes the way that we label money in our conversations and engage with money. And it just kind of creates this cycle. So if we're always reactively engaging with our resources and our money based on just kind of what I just kind of laid out, it's very difficult to perceive, why would I ever want to proactively engage with money? Because my only relationship with it is negative. So you want me to proactively engage negatively with money?
You're speaking Greek to me now.
That's exactly, but you see where that goes. Like you start to apply this side of the equation with this side of the equation. But when you actually engage in the other side of the equation, what happens is that you start to spark a sense of calm and a sense of peace. There's more serotonin that's regulating through your body. Their financial intimacy from a financially productive side of it can produce levels of oxytocin and dopamine and warmth and a sense of connection. And it's one of my biggest desires, honestly. That's why I try to have good energy when I talk about money, is that I would love for people to experience money, the resource, as something that's productive, both things that we can do now and things that we can plan for both for the future as well. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It just takes a little bit of time and a little bit of patience.
Yeah, I tell people all the time, money isn't good or bad. It's a tool, right?
It is.
You just have to understand how to use that tool and having these type of conversations. When you were talking, what came up for me is, you always hear, I don't think it's a female thing, but I'll just say, I'll be guilty to say, we always say we want to do some shopping therapy, right? And we're not thinking about the consequences of if you do have a mate, is that structured in such a way that is sustainable? Like, are you doing that for coping mechanism or, so what's driving even that behavior? So that's really good. So let me just shift gears a little bit. We all are feeling inflation, whether it's at the gas pump or when we're, getting our typical household goods. Tell me, what's the driving force behind that? Let's really unpack inflation right now.
Yeah. We're seeing inflation that's happening across the board in a lot of different areas, and I think that's why everyone feels it, because we're actually feeling it in just about every domain of our life. This would be very different if we just saw gas prices spike up, but I can go buy my groceries at the grocery store and then not see that reflected there, right? We're seeing inflation as it relates to housing prices. If there was somebody who's wanting to purchase a home right now, not only are we seeing high home prices because of supply and demand, but we're also seeing high interest rates based on the Federal Reserve raising the Federal Reserve's rate. So in this instance, it does feel unbearable. It is a major national issue as it relates to addressing it. But we have to step back, because what I know about human behavior, right, is that we live in a moment and it's very easy to forget the past. Before we incurred inflation, we were experiencing deflation. Do you not remember when gas prices dropped well below $2 and things appeared to be really, really cheap at that point in time as we were navigating the pandemic? Nobody said a word.
Didn't hear anything. It wasn't even
a word about deflation. We're good with this, right? We're enduring lockdowns and things of that nature, whatever it may be. But that actually speaks to, if we're looking at this from an economic perspective, this whole notion of supply and demand. So because of the pandemic and because of federal interventions that were in place as we were trying to understand what we were dealing with, and then quite early on, we didn't have the therapeutics. We didn't know how to help patients who were navigating this. We were all just kind of figuring this out together.
Right.
And unfortunately, because of that, we lost a lot of people, both here in the United States and internationally. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that we don't need to forget, because in the midst of that, when you heard about the pandemic, I don't care if you're from a blue state or a red state, when I went to the grocery store, nothing was on the shelves.
Right.
Literally.
Right.
We
We,
literally went to church and the pastor said, y'all need to take some stuff back, because there's no reason why you need to like buy up all that stuff. And in the midst of this, we have individuals who are working, and there's a complete disregard to their safety and
right.
livelihood, as long as I get what I need and what I want to navigate this unknown thing. We had the Paycheck Protection Program.
Mm-hmm.
We've had stimulus payments and things of that nature to stimulate the economy. So what's fascinating to me now, as we have conversations about about inflation in general, is that literally every part of society, just about every part, took part in receiving some federal dollars to keep
Mm-hmm.
their practices afloat, whether it's a law office, whether it's a doctor's office, right? Because at a certain point, depending on the type of practice that you had, you weren't seeing clients,
Right.
many of which took part in the Paycheck Protection Program, which are these trillions of dollars that came from the federal government, right? So everyone took part in this in some capacity. So what happened at that point in time was that while supply was dwindling, right? Because now we aren't manufacturing as many goods, people are staying home, people are getting sick, we have to shut down, all these different things. We have this infusion of cash that was pumped into the economy, that for many people were just kind of sitting on it for a while to kind of figure out, all right, what am I going to do with this money?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And as soon as we open the doors to the economy, it's almost, Renata, it's like you're planning an event and you're not expecting 1,000 people to rush the door as soon as you open the doors, and you're only planning for 250 because of whatever reason. That's
Mm-hmm.
exactly what happened, or what is continuing to happen, because we have not revved up the capacity just yet to offset the demand, right? And because of that, we have more dollars in the economy chasing after goods and services. And if there are fewer goods and services, well, quite naturally, if you're a business owner, you have limited capacity resources. You're going to say, well, I'm going to raise the price to see
Right.
if I get to this breaking point where I pull down demand or get it to a nice spot to where
Mm-hmm.
I know this is what I can charge for a good service. That's exactly what we're navigating right now. And that's the most simplified way of thinking about it from a supply and demand perspective. But
Okay.
it won't last always, and that's human behavior. When we're experiencing it and we're in the midst of it, um, we feel it, and quite honestly, some of us feel it more than others. One of the
Mm-hmm.
things that we don't talk about in the national news is there are stark differences between inflation and inflation and, let's say, our jobs report that just came out recently, right?
Mm-hmm.
The unemployment rate, generally speaking, as an average for the country, is around 3.5%. For African Americans, it's around 6.3%,
Mm-hmm.
right? If we
Big
start thinking about inflation, right? Inflation actually has always been fairly inherent in Black communities, especially if they're food deserts and you're
Mhm.
having to buy a gallon of milk for $5 where someone else could have bought that same dollar of milk for $1.50 or
Right.
$2, or
Mhm.
bread that's $1 and you're paying $3 for that bread based on where you are. So inflation is not new to the Black community. But I would argue that the impact on inflation that we're not having a deeper conversation on is, if it was already that way for these communities prior to this, what
Mhm.
has it been through this, right?
Right.
And the impact on that is pretty significant. We're seeing credit card debt usage go up, mind you. Who do you
Mhm.
think, who do you think are going to be the primary users of credit cards to navigate the situation? They're going to be our lower income, working class families and households, and that's how many of them have been able to effectively kind of navigate things,
Mhm.
given there's still a whole host of things that people are trying to get comfortable with as it relates still to the coronavirus and the economy in general. So that's what we're experiencing right now. The decisions that the Fed has made, generally speaking, when they raise rates, right, in terms of how banks share or borrow money from one another and what they charge each other to be able to maintain a certain amount in banks in their bank. Um, Quite honestly, when we think about this big picture, though, hold on, where was I going with that? I just want to make sure I catch my point. I kind of lost it a little bit. Yeah. So as they're raising rates, we need to be mindful that this isn't a supply decision. Generally
Mm.
speaking, we raise rates, it's to slow business development down, right?
Mhm.
And slow the economy. It's very important for people to understand that as this is happening, the Fed, in effect, is trying to slow demand down. So if that's what we're doing, we should ultimately start to see the jobs numbers and reports and things of that nature kind of come down a little bit, over time. We're not
Mhm.
trying to induce a recession, but we're trying to cool down spending or get liquidity out of the markets that we infused into the markets
So it
as
seems
a result
like
of
we're
the
trying to
pandemic.
correct the market is what it sounds like we're trying to
It
do. We're
is.
trying to
It
correct it.
absolutely is. It absolutely is. So we're adding a little bit of salt. We said, all right, we added too much. Let me water it down with the water, or Kool-Aid, sugar, right? Just like, man, that's too sweet. Let me pour water in it real quick. That's exactly. If you think about, that's exactly what we're doing to kind
Yeah,
of get this to this perfect balance, right? The unfortunate part about it is that there is going to be a little bit of pain as a nation that we have to, or not necessarily have to endure, but it is something that we are enduring as a collective. And our best hope is that once we get through this, we start to see the rebounds in the markets. We start to see supply chains kind of ramp up to where they once were. And we see demand suppressed so that we start to see prices come down in a multitude of areas, whether it's housing, whether it's, think about childcare right now.
I know.
We're not even talking about childcare inflation with all the moms who are worried about sending their kids to school because of that. That's increased demand for childcare service workers. But what do you do if you're a business? We can't take on all this demand. We'll
Right.
raise prices, right, to kind of mitigate demand. So we're seeing it in all areas. But my hope is that in 2023, mid to the latter part, we get to a point to where we see supply chains both domestically and then globally ramp up in such a way to where we're not experiencing the same type of increase in prices that we're seeing across the board in all of our lives.
Now, I heard you mention a little bit or a lot about recession, right? Can you let's talk about that a little bit. Like, what exactly does that look like? Are we in recession? Are
Yeah.
we headed? I know economists are saying they have mixed views on it. What say Dr. Thomas? I want to know what's your thoughts and get not just your thoughts, but educate us in this area.
Unfortunately, I don't view the work that I do from a political lens. I need to start there. And regardless of your political affiliation, if you're honest with yourself, right? If Trump was still in office and we had 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, Democrats would be saying, oh, it's a recession. And then Trump would be saying, well, it's not a recession. Job reports look good. We're still seeing really solid consumer consumption in the economy. We're seeing fairly solid business investment in the economy. Our net exports are down simply because of some things that are happening with Russia and other places and trade agreements with, not trade agreements, but trading related things with China. And government spending is down, rightfully so, because we're not spending what we were spending during the pandemic. Okay. And vice versa, right? It's almost like we're arguing two different sides. We're arguing the same thing, just depending on who it's favorable for. When we think about the technical term of a recession, which is 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, that is technically a recession or a contraction in the economy. No different than what we see in natural business cycles of businesses. And they happen for various reasons. It can be because the business is plateaued, or it can be because there's some outside factor that's influencing all of this that has very little to do with the economy, but how we are course correcting, using the language that you used earlier, on the tail end of this pandemic. What is new normal and how are we finding it? Okay. So in theory, yes, we are in a recession. We're experiencing a little bit of contraction. Now, the question is how deep and prolonged of a recession will we be enduring? The reason why the Democrats have been so adamant, the Fed has been so adamant not to call it a recession, and there's the National Bureau of Economic Research that then looks at the context of what's happening, and then they make the final call to say that, yes, we are. And traditionally, if we're experiencing it the way that we experienced in 2008, 2009, 2010, as we were navigating that, we saw job losses. We saw people losing homes. Across the board, we were seeing things impacted across just about every facet of the economy. At that point in time, I was an accountant. And we always used to joke, if you're an accountant, you can always leave and get a job. But when we were navigating 2009, what was odd was that people were leaving the firm, and about a month or a month and a half out, they weren't employed. And now, as I kind of think about this now, right, you can kind of see it in, retrospect, but we aren't there. And any of the major news sources that are saying, well, this company is laying off so many people and this company is laying off so many people, a lot of it is because some of these companies kind of outgrew themselves and weren't being disciplined in their growth. So what they're doing is just doing some modest course corrections in many instances to be able to ensure that they're able to manage the expense side of their income statement when they're reporting their quarterly and annual numbers so that their net revenues are where they need to be in order to ensure that we're meeting Wall Street expectations. And then the stock is doing good because as a business, your CEO's responsibility is to his or her shareholders. Okay. So now we have to step back and think contextually. Are the decisions being made, right? Because we're actually enduring a downturn in such a way where these companies believe that it's only going to get worse? Or is these leaders in these companies weren't being very disciplined and they hired more than they needed to hire, not being mindful that more than likely we're going to have a correction. And in order to address the need for liquidity in cash, in instances where there's a little bit of turbulence, they're making decisions to potentially cut some jobs and things of that nature. So technically, yes, we're in a recession. I don't say that like with a doom and gloom type perspective, because what I know is that language is triggering. Right. And we can actually create a recessionary environment if people are navigating in fear and they respond fearfully, even though there are a multitude of other factors that are saying that the economy is stabilizing. We are engaging in a course correction of finding what is the new normal right now as we then grow and proceed from COVID. So I kind of look at this more as like a post-COVID correction, so to speak. I don't sense a prolonged deep recession. And that's my stance on it. And this is the thing. If we've already endured 2 consecutive quarters of a recession, we've actually already endured the recession, because the numbers right now could actually be saying that the economy is doing just fine. So when we get these numbers, we're actually speaking in hindsight in terms of what we've already experienced, and we got through it just fine through a multitude of means.
All of the fear mongering that's going on right now, the narrative is just strong right now. I want to find out from you, because we're getting close to our time. what are some optimal financial strategies that somebody can implement now to be more on the reactive side, despite the fear mongering that's going on?
Absolutely. Honestly, I one of the most effective things that people can do at this point in time is to monitor what they are watching and what they're engaging with news and media outlets. I'm
Mhm.
just going to be, as someone who teaches like wealth management, personal finance, and all these other different things, one of the things that I am very keenly aware of is that there's a lot of data visualization. There are a lot of um, different types of language that's being used on YouTube and Instagram and other places to kind of actually spike up the central nervous system to get people to start behaving emotionally. And why do we want people to engage emotionally? Is because when people are actually in a neutral, stable place, they actually have access to their prefrontal cortex. And when you have access to your prefrontal cortex, you can actually think through information and actually vet it in such a way to discern whether or not what I'm engaging with is, a bunch of what's the right word? I can't think of the right word right now, but information that is just so outlandish, so to speak, or using like, oh, the economy is a precipitous drop in the S&P 500, right? Using those type of ways to kind of communicate, it triggers us emotionally. And if it triggers us emotionally, whether or not we understand the factual side or nature of it, we are going to behave in such a way. And as I mentioned earlier, if we don't have a level of understanding about the way that we manage finances, stress, anxiety, fear can actually be triggers for the way that we spend money suboptimally. So, what I'm getting at is that when we can step away from that, we can get to more of a neutral place psychologically and emotionally to actually be able to engage with our money with a sensibility that is aware, that is mindful, and is not stressed in doing so. That would be the first thing. The other thing would be as well, it's very hard to engage with money if you're stressed. So we need to not be stressed as best as we can to actually look at, well, what can I do as I navigate this? And I'm going to be very honest with you. There are going to be situations in our lives where we have limited cash flow and opportunity to generate more cash flow at the current time, where we may have to take on debt, right? To navigate a certain time period. I'm not going to say that that's never not a situation because sometimes it is. But the win, though, in that is that if you know that you have to take on debt to navigate something, well, then the game is how can I take on the least amount of debt possible with the resources that I have, right? So that I can navigate this in a way that once we get to the back end of this, I feel like I have something that's manageable and I can work myself out of. As opposed to oftentimes what happens is the what the hell effect. That is psychology, where people start making decisions and they say, what the hell? And they just kind of keep going down that rabbit hole and they build this deep mound of debt that once they come back to their senses, right, then
So
they
deep
realize what
at
they've
this
done.
point. Yeah.
And now I got to dig out of it. So, what I'm saying is, as we navigate this part of the area, if you have the capacity to pick up a side gig or opportunity to make money to leverage your skill sets, and use that strategically as a way to mitigate or to offset inflation, I think that that is always optimal, first and foremost. Secondly, if you have to utilize debt, think more strategically about how can I utilize the least amount of debt possible by actually engaging with your spending plan. And if you don't already have one, that's okay. You don't have to do an entire spending plan. You can actually do sections of it. This is where I'm feeling my pain point the most. Well, let's just focus on a spending plan on that particular area or section of your life so you're not overwhelmed by the totality of everything. And let's focus on keeping creating a game plan to say that, you know what, if I shore up some things here and there, that means I can save $50 that I otherwise would have charged on a credit card. And if we do that over a 12-month period, that's $600 plus interest and other things, whatever it may be, of savings. And sometimes that's the win, and that deserves to be celebrated just as much as someone who is in a capacity to be able to save, because you can't save if you don't have the extra discretionary income to save. Right? It just doesn't magically happen. So there are other things that need to be worked through. But I want to be very clear here. There are going to be a lot of people who are going to shame people and say, why didn't you do better? Why didn't you do X, Y, and Z? And forgive me. Well, don't, because I mean what I'm about to say is that those people don't actually work with people in the real world.
Right.
They don't. Now, there are some people who are mismanaging their money, but then there are some people who are doing absolutely everything that they know that they can do, right? To navigate what they're navigating. And they're trying incredibly hard. And actually, that's the vast majority
I was
of
gonna say, that sounds like that's the vast amount of people. They really want to be able to make a difference with their financial snapshot, but they really don't understand or where to even get started. Where do I even start?
Sure. Like for me, for instance, I do financial coaching sessions through my Modem Solutions platform. And it really, what I view my work as is that I get to help calm people as they're navigating the process. I get to see the finish line before they get to see the finish line, but being able to help them to break it up in such a way to where it's something that they're willing to engage with psychologically and emotionally, to actually start to work towards making some reasonable progress. And then also understanding too that it's an unfair assumption to think that the way of being who you are for 25, 30, 35 years of your life is going to change overnight. It's not, right?
No.
And that's okay. It's a part of the process, and you are growing, you are learning. And even though you may not see the full benefit of your work, but if we start thinking about this intergenerationally, right? For a niece or a nephew or a grandchild, and you're starting means that what you're doing now is going to have
a greater effect
over decades, even a century.
Wealth gap. Yeah,
yes, it is huge. And you don't see it now because we're so focused and admired in the now. But just starting means that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and you may not be able to be here to experience it. But I can just about guarantee you that you're starting this journey. You're engaging in thinking about different money mindsets, maybe based on something that's suboptimal that you grew up learning. But now you know that I need to think about things slightly differently, but I do appreciate my loved ones for giving me what they could give me. No shame there. But in just doing that, it just creates an opportunity to have the type of impact that most families want to have for their loved ones for generations to come. And even with the little, you can do a lot, because that's the benefit of time, and time value of money and all that jazz, whatever it may be. It's like time's the biggest asset. So a little bit over a lot of time is a lot. So my biggest thing is, even in the midst of navigating, and I don't want to downplay this, that I know that families are struggling, but I also need for families to know that if you are doing the best that you can do, you're not struggling. You're fighting. You're being resilient. You are showing resolve. You are not allowing for this thing that we're navigating to get the best of you, right? You're actually fighting back. You're pushing back. And that's what champions do. So I would argue that instead of saying that I'm struggling through this, you're being a champion through this. And I think it's important for people to hear that, because we don't always communicate that type of language to people as they're enduring something. And then when we say struggling, it's like there's something wrong with me, and people assume the worst or whatever it may be. And there are people who are like that. But I want to encourage you to keep being a champion. And if at any point in time, there's a whole host of services, I would be more than happy to connect you. If somebody wants to work with me, that can work as well. And where we can just kind of figure out how to navigate things a little bit more effectively than what you're already doing. to help you navigate what we're doing and then to position yourself to take advantage of the amazing things that lie ahead.
Well, this has been impactful. I'm going to put my readers on because I see that there's some comments here. So let's see. We have Roslyn. She's from NYC. Hey, Roslyn. We got JP. Thank you for catching us on LinkedIn. J. Marie. Love Dr. Thomas' perspective on this. How will this recession differ from the last for the average American? I don't know if you want to address that.
That's actually a really good question. Actually, this recession is already a gazillion times better than 2008, 2009, comparatively speaking. And when we look at that recession, it wasn't just the fact that people were getting loans from banks, right? Like the bank would say, oh, if you do this and do this, you could qualify for a $500,000 house. And then people would get the high end of that. And then some things actually started to collapse and fall upon itself. So not only were we seeing that with individuals who are owning homes, but there were people who were investing in homes during that time as well that purchased homes to rent, that they fell behind on their mortgages and their tenants had no idea, and their tenants ended up getting evicted.
But also the subprime loans was just running crazy back then as well.
It was rampant, right? So now we're extending loans, and when we think about subprime, and that varies depending on the banking institution, some different metrics. But generally speaking, anything less than 700, and as we start working down that list, because when we start experiencing recessionary time periods, banks usually start to tighten up. And Renardo, I know you know this. They start to tighten up and say, hey, we want to see 700 or higher, which is usually a good place to kind of be at. But once people start falling below that, okay, there are varying levels of risk, and there are reasons why banks make those assessments. And we're talking about really, really smart people that are creating algorithms that are literally assessing risk of an individual, that when you look at these things empirically, actually kind of show that, yeah, if someone is in this particular area, if they experience a financial shock, the likelihood of them being able to pay you back is incredibly limited. So there's definitely some validity in terms of the process, but you're absolutely right. Subprimes were running rampant, but that's usually what happens when the market is doing really, really well. Everybody feels as if they're smarter than what they actually are, right? If the markets are doing well and we're not experiencing a financial shock, like I mentioned earlier, anybody can feel like a genius. In fact, I bet you, especially all the people who are listening right now, I bet you had a cousin, an uncle, an aunt, a nephew, like somebody come to you to talk about some hustle, right? Because everybody's making money, everybody's winning. This is a can't miss opportunity. I'm gonna go create tutorials and videos until it doesn't, right? And we do this on our side. We do this in the media. But the principles are the principles in that regard. And when we start to deviate away from the principles and we start to get caught up in the exuberance and this whole notion of fear of missing out because everybody's making all this money. Renarda, I've driven from California to the Carolinas, from Florida to Minnesota. Everybody ain't rich, regardless of what they look like on social media. That's not the reality of the real world.
Yeah.
So when the markets are good, people start to become overconfident. And when people become overconfident, they stop leaning into the metrics and data that has kept us safe over years and years and years. And they start making decisions because they feel as if I can take on more risk. And we saw that in 2008, 2009. So I don't think that's going to be the case this time around at all. With the job numbers, I would love to see more manufacturing jobs coming. The jobs report, if you actually look at it, the vast majority of the jobs that we saw created were service in jobs. So what I'm hoping to see as we get into the third quarter and as we get deeper into the third quarter and fourth quarter this year, is the next job reports to kind of coincide with this whole notion of supply chains are ramping up, to start to see more hiring in that jobs report,
Right.
specifically from manufacturing sectors. That's what I'm looking for as we move forward. And I think that once we start seeing that, that's going to be that signal through the noise to say
I like
supply is ramping up, hiring will coincide, but then we're going to see demand side kind of come down a little bit, supply go up, and we start to see prices fall gradually over time.
Let's see if we have some more comments. So the next thing, CJ says, I work at a tech company, and surprisingly, we've created at least 10 new jobs in the past month. The majority of new employees are from abroad. Um,
But you don't hear that narrative. If we go to the news right now, the only thing that you're going to hear is this company and that company is we fired so many middle management people. And again, context matters.
mhm.
And unfortunately, headlines dominate conversations. So the fact that you're sharing that, I think, is a powerful thing because we have to have this nuanced conversation contextually in terms of where growth is happening and where it isn't. And if it isn't happening, why? Right? Is it because of the economy or is it really because the CEOs were overconfident and they took some bets and some risks that they shouldn't have taken, which is why now some of their lower level employees are having to bear the consequences of that.
Okay, I don't want us to lose. Let me just quickly go through the rest of there's people are excited for you. I told you guys this was going to be a great conversation. And, I enjoyed my offline conversation with Dr. Thomas that I was like, you've got to come on. So the next person is Jay Marie. Jay Marie said propaganda. And then he said, any recommendations for online outlets or YouTube channels that just present the facts? That's a good one too.
Very good one. There actually is a website that I actually just started watching, and I think it's called 1440 News. You
Okay.
can get it. You can get it on Facebook, but their whole stance is that we're just providing the information. You dissect it, you decide. So there's no political spin and things of that
Just
nature.
looking at information, straight
Yeah,
information.
just
Good.
give me the information. Because language is powerful and it's so subtle. Well, actually, it's not subtle. It's very intentional, quite honestly, and it's very hard to navigate through all of it because sometimes the way that language is presented to us, it can actually trigger our own confirmation bias based on the relationships and circles that we navigate, where we want to believe something to be true even though it's not true. And as an academic, that's probably one of the most difficult skills to develop, even when doing research, is that I cannot do my research with an agenda. I can hope that the findings bear out because this is what I'm seeing or what I'm observing, but I actually have to test it and empirically show for it. And there are several times where something has come up and I said, you know what, that just doesn't make sense to me. But then I have to step outside of me. And then I have to go engage with people who think differently, who view differently, and have different experiences where this is telling that story to be able to say, all right, I see it now. And there's actually no way that I could see it because I don't navigate that space in a real way. Right. And so, yeah, there's a lot of propaganda. I try to stay away from news networks. Honestly, I have not come across a YouTube channel where the individual who is speaking on a channel will be super excited about getting you to want to buy something or sell something or get this investment because they're getting dollars behind the scenes that you don't know about. And then the very next day turn around and say, oh, that's a horrible thing and you shouldn't do it. And I'm sitting there, I was like, didn't you just tell everybody last
It's
week?
contradictory. Yeah.
Right? And then they just move on as if they've never said anything. Unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I just don't exist in that world. That's why I don't do a lot of like the talking head stuff, quite honestly, simply because there's consequences to information. And if I'm going to speak on something, I need to be fairly confident that what I'm saying is delivering real sustainable value to an individual, to a person. And to play the algorithms and the social media and YouTube game in terms of just constantly producing content and saying nothing at all, it's like eating a lot of empty calories and just feeling sick after a while because you're
Correct.
trying, you see the headline, you're like, oh, this might be something. And then you watch it and you're like, they didn't say anything at all. And you go to
Right.
the next one and you go to the next one. It's just empty calories that we should not be consuming. So 1440, I think, is a pretty cool thing to kind of explore at this point in time. Um, you may not be, depending on what your interests are, I typically just go to the source, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the CPI numbers are coming out, I'm going to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? If numbers are coming out for whatever it may be, I just go to the source. I read their write up because it's very direct and matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
CPI, Consumer Pricing Index, inflation is up in this particular area. This is why, and then they just move on, right? But if you hear it from the news, like they just start adding stuff or not speaking to things holistically or clearly, where you miss all of these key data points, where it's
Mm-hmm.
just very easy to read. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes to kind of look over it. And then there you go, you got it, and you know kind of where we are. And then you can start to piece things together. Like these
Mm-hmm.
people aren't, I have a PhD and I work with other people who have doctorates and da da da. Like at the end of the day, I don't think anybody's that smart, honestly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the same conversations I'm having around certain tables could be the exact same conversation I'm having in a barbershop. The only difference is that these people in the barbershop don't have the skill set at that
Mm-hmm.
point in time to empirically prove their beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of research is just common sense verified
Mm-hmm.
through a
Mm-hmm. The
statistical.
ownership is on you to be more intentionally involved, right?
Absolutely.
You have to be right involved with all of the things that's being put out there and being able to sift through what's true and what's not. And it's not hard if you actually take the time to actually comb through it. Um, wow, you've just unpacked so much here tonight. And so let me just, there's two more questions that I want to make sure we get to really.
Renata, I could go for 3 hours.
So you're very passionate about it, and I love it, which is why I brought you here. Somebody said resilient. Thanks for the reminder. Sage says it's challenging to find a side hustle that doesn't interrupt my peace. And also, Sage says when it comes to building wealth for yourself and your legacy, how do you determine when you've made enough and it's time to enjoy and rest? Great question,
That
Sage.
is a great question. Um, this is the thing. I don't think that you can build wealth without rest. And there is a culture in terms of a don't sleep culture, don't do this culture, grind, grind, grind culture. But most of the wealthy people I know aren't working at the lower levels of
Well, health
their
is wealth. You know, that's the other thing. Health is wealth.
absolutely
We have to move
health.
into a society where we're working smarter instead of harder.
Yeah, 100% is wealth because what most people don't see on the back end is that wealth, if we create it as an individual and we don't have appropriate conversation within our family dynamics with our children, we don't have estate planning done and a will set up or maybe a trust because we know our kids and we know that one may not be able to handle resources the way that maybe another is. So we need to ensure that there's some ground rules that they follow. Generally speaking, what most people don't understand is that wealth is typically gone in 3 generations. That's the data. If we start thinking about white, just more specifically white culture and transference of white wealth in general, most of it's gone within 3 generations. So if we step back a little bit and say, all right, I'm building wealth and I want these extraordinary things to happen generationally, intergenerationally, that means that we have to be as intentional about cultivating relationship so that we can actually have the space to educate people and within our lives and our family, friends, not friends, but kids or whatever it may be. So that if we pass these resources off that we've worked so hard for, that they understand that we have a family culture of creating and generating wealth for the next generation. Like that's the expectation. And we have to actually have those conversations like as soon as they're 3, as soon as they're 4, as soon as they're 5. Hey, I want to be building wealth. But in doing this, it's very important that you're going to be a contributing factor to that, right? And these are some ways in which we're going to build this. And I would love to be able to hand this off to you. And here are the tools and the keys to be able to do it. But I would never put this whole notion of wealth above relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So for me, quite honestly, I don't have a lofty wealth creation goal. I don't. All right. I can literally live in a tiny house, have no car note, be on a lake. And I'm good. I'm being
Peace
dead
of
serious.
mind. That sounds like a peace of mind to me.
I'm good. Like, so when we think about wealth, it's very important to understand that whatever that number is, or whatever that thing is for you, that's for you. Your wealth does not have to look like my wealth. My wealth does not have to look like your wealth. But what we do is we compare wealth positions and we say, oh, because this person got this. Y'all, I drive a 2005 Toyota Camry. Do you think I care about certain things? So you're probably talking to the wrong person.
So point B.
Right? So for me, it's more of having flexibility and cash flow so that we can experience life today. I'm not going to forfeit my family. I'm not going to forfeit my relationship with my wife, with my kids, for something that is as fleeting as money is. Money comes and money goes. I think it's important to have it, to manage it effectively. But I think that sometimes we can go too far in terms of thinking that we have to have a $5 million, maybe $10 million nest egg. Do you know what the average wealth position is of a Black household in the United States right now? The median? $17,000.
Wow.
So if we look at this contextually,
$17,000.
$17,000. This was a 2020. There's a 2020 study that was that came from some. I can share it with you all, Renata, and you can share it with the group. And there's a great infographic that kind of goes into this. So when we think about wealth, honestly, anything is going to be better than what's currently happening. And that's what I'm getting at, is that there's this facade of what's happening in social media and in all these other spaces versus what the reality is as relates to what wealth is looking like, especially in the Black community. And so what I would say is think about I think that the better question is, what is my capacity to set money aside consistently over time, taking on the necessary level of risk to achieve the return that I want to achieve, to be able to see the growth that I hope for. Just because you invest, and if you put all your money in a portfolio of bonds, you can't expect to see the
But you also, like we said, you have to sometimes adjust your lifestyle too. That goes in as well. You got to think realistically. And like you said, put the blinders on and quit trying to keep up with the Joneses, because the Joneses, they don't even exist. So I just want
to practice really quickly. Why do people keep up with the Joneses? Because they are seeking the validation of the Joneses.
Right.
So let's take this a level deeper, right? Because I think that sometimes we just kind of leave that high level. No, we do it because we want the validation of social circles, social networks of individuals to feel as if we're on par or we've arrived, and we want someone to validate us. What is marketing? All of marketing is telling you what you don't have, which creates an emotional and psychological deficit, to create a void within you internally, than to tell you that we have this product or service to fill that very void that we just created and pay us X, Y, and Z, X, Y, and Z, right? And that's the culture that we continuously navigate. My biggest thing is when it comes to wealth and things of that nature is take some time to sit back and really thoughtfully think about, what is wealth to me internally? And then as you navigate your financial journey, the litmus test for you achieving that wealth is you being internally and externally consistent towards achieving your wealth objective goals. And I guarantee you, if you do that, not only will you exceed the national averages here in the United States, but you're probably going to amass or accumulate something just by starting right where you are and not focusing on the end in mind right now, probably more than maybe individuals and people in your household and your family generally across the board, just by getting started. So you have to own it. There are ways to go about understanding how do I establish some guidelines, some metric. And again, I can help you sit down and kind of think through what that could look like for you. But whatever your wealth goal is, I want you to own it because it's uniquely you and it uniquely brings you joy and contentment. Not because you see that I've done something or I'm doing something and I seem happy. That doesn't mean that that's going to bring you and deliver you happiness or value. So real wealth is being consistent in the way that you use money to produce a level of joy that's authentically who you are. And if you can do that, how is that not real wealth?
I know.
You know what I'm saying? Like, how is that not real wealth? You can be exactly who you are. Use money in a way that's productive to the things that bring you real joy, sustainable, lasting happiness in that regard. I think that that's where it's at. Now, I know that was a different answer than maybe you might have been.
that was perfect. And Dr. Thomas, I knew you were going to bring so much value. I want to personally thank you, and I'm sure all of our audience, you can tell by the comments that this was a much needed conversation, and we'll definitely have to invite you back. So guys, if you still have some more questions for Dr. Thomas or myself, please leave it in the comments. I will make sure that I forward it to him. And you can see on the screen where you can follow him at Modem Solutions and at Black Financial Culture. Now, in addition to all of the value that he's already given to us in the last hour, Dr. Thomas is going to give out 2 t-shirts from his Black Financial Culture for the first 2 people to actually inbox me. It's now, you inbox me the word, I'm free. I am now free. And those who do that, the first 2 people to do that, I will forward your information to Dr. Thomas so that he can give you 2 free t-shirts. Dr. Thomas, is there anything else you want to say in closing? I don't know if there's anything else that you could say, because you've given us so much insight. And I love the key takeaways of the actionable steps that you've given us that we can start right now today.
I think that the biggest thing is that money isn't the main thing, you are. Money isn't the main thing, you are. Because money does not exist without you. Money doesn't exist without us. Money is this current, it's this energy that flows related to trust and all these other different things and all these other different dynamics. So if you really want to be able to optimize money, you have to be able to engage in really studying you, knowing you, allowing yourself to be financially vulnerable, to unpack things that you need to be able to unpack to move further along in a healthy way so that you can receive new information to be able to course correct when necessary in order to do that. But I personally believe that financial vulnerability is the ultimate financial growth strategy. So a lot of times we spend a lot of time thinking about everybody else and how can I be like that person and let me study that person. When is the last time that you spent hours on hours on hours studying you? And I want to leave that there because I think that we miss that because there's a lot of self-value. There's a lot of self-worth things that need to be recognized. Even if you've made mistakes, we all do. Perfection is not required for this process. And, but I really want to challenge you to really step back and to be able to see yourself and know that where you are does not have to define who you are. Okay. And that you can move forward productively, regardless of what you've done or wish that you would have done or wish you would have started doing. That's okay. Unpack those things, learn from those lessons, and then think about, all right, what's one small thing that I can do to do something better? That's it. And just build from that one step at a time, but extend yourself some compassion and grace while you're navigating this process, because again, you're not going to be perfect. But every time you do a little bit more, you're rewiring your neural circuitry. You are adjusting your emotions and your attitudes, and a lot of things just gradually start to change over time. Just stay the course, start small, focus on your baseline in terms of how far you've gone, as opposed to the finish line and thinking how far you have yet to go. And I'll just leave it there.
Well, thank you so much. And you got to come back. I mean, you can't leave us here. You've got to come back. We'll figure it out. But thank you so much. So you guys have a great night, and thank you so much for tuning in and showing our guests so much love and for participating. You guys have a great night.